Today I will show you how to prepare an active sourdough starter in just 14 days. A sourdough starter begins by simply mixing flour and water to form a wet, pasty mixture. This mixture, over the course of a few days, is going to pick up the natural wild bacteria and yeasts from the air. These microbes in the starter culture will need about a week to balance out. Eventually, acid-producing bacteria will win out in the balance, and the flour-water mixture will begin to favor specific yeasts that thrive in acidic conditions. Through the process of fermentation, the byproduct carbon dioxide is produced, and this is the leavening power we will harness when we make a loaf of bread. Thereby, using just the simple ordinary ingredients of flour, water, and salt, we can end up with a wonderful loaf of nutritious, easy to digest, beautiful sourdough bread. If you look below in the description of this YouTube video, I have included a PDF document that you can download, which has my notes about each day of the process. I have also added timestamps to this file so you can more easily locate the particular part of the video as you work on your starter day by day. I have additional videos on how I maintain my starter regularly, as well as how to use this starter to build a leaven. Also, please be sure to see my post on how to make a basic open crumb sourdough bread. Those links are also offered in the description below. Okay, let's get started. On day 1, I will begin by preparing our flour mix. This is the flour we will use to feed our starter culture. I prefer to use a mix that includes rye flour, as it is full of nutrients and enzymes that can help speed up the sourdough starter process. As a base, I like to use bread flour to help make the starter stronger. You can definitely begin by using all-purpose flour at this point in the process. I'll go ahead and add 350 grams bread flour to a bowl. And now on top of that, I'll add dark rye flour and bring the final flour weight up to 500 grams. This gives me a 30% rye mixture. Whisk this together so that the rye is evenly dispersed. Now grab a small glass jar. This is where we will mix our flour-water paste. I like to work with small quantities of flour so that I prevent excess waste. So we'll go ahead and add 30 grams purified or bottled water. And now on top of that, we'll add an equal weight of flour mix, 30 grams. I really like these silicone spatulas. They fit nicely in the jar to mix. I'll go ahead and stir the water and flour together very well. You want to be sure that no dry bits of flour remain in the jar. Then get a piece of cheesecloth. We'll be using cheesecloth because it allows open air contact with the flour mixture, but prevents large dust particles from getting inside the jar. Cut out an appropriate size piece and fasten it on using a rubber band. We'll leave this mixture to sit at warm room temperature, approximately 75 degrees Fahrenheit, for 24 hours or so. It's now day 2, and we're not doing much this day. Just a simple stir is all that is necessary. You can see we've got a bit of a discolored, darker layer on the surface. This is due to the mixture drying out a little bit. You can see it even better looking into the jar when I move the mixture around with my spatula. This is no problem. We'll just mix with the spatula, stir around a little bit, get everything wetted again. At this point, I like to actually recommend transferring the mixture to a fresh jar to help with the prevention of mold. That looks much better. We'll place the cheesecloth back on top and fasten again using the rubber band. Let this mixture sit out at warm room temperature, again, about 24 hours. Now on day 3, we will begin our feeding regimen. Today I was thrilled to find that the mixture had really grown over the last day. Really impressive amount of growth. This is a sign that some microbes have inoculated our flour water paste. We've successfully caught some wild yeast. The mixture has become full of life and air, but in fact it may come as a surprise that this is not the correct balance of bacteria and yeast we want to make sourdough bread. It will take some time before the correct balance is worked out, as you will see over the course of this video. I will get a new jar here again, mostly to show you the consistency. It's really good to write down details about your starter throughout this process. Make note of things like volume increase, consistency, and smell. We'll weigh out about 20 grams starter. It's good to try to keep everything fairly exact, but no need to be too strict about it. We'll then add in an equal weight of water, pour right into the glass jar along with the starter, and then I'll measure out the flour and get that in there as well. After adding the flour, now we will stir well. No dry bits like I've mentioned already. The stirring takes approximately a minute or less. I like to combine all 3 ingredients and then mix, but you may prefer to mix the water and starter first and add in the flour second. From here on out, I'm going to use a rubber band that will allow us to more easily gauge volume increase in the jar. It'll make it easier to see growth at each feed. Cover with the cheesecloth and let sit again at warm room temperature. Okay, we've got lots of activity on the morning of day 4 now. You can see a pretty big increase in the total volume of the mixture in the last 12 hours. Using the rubber band as a gauge looks like maybe 3 to 4 times increase. If you listen carefully, you can hear all the air bubbles popping while I stir. Like I said, it's only been about 12 hours since the last feed, and surprisingly, the mixture has become very, very runny. And there is now also a noticeable funky smell, kind of like cheese. I'll measure out another 20 grams and add in the same amount of water and flour by weight. Like I said before, it doesn't have to be super exact. Get it as close as you can without causing yourself a headache. Stir. Reposition the rubber band if necessary, cover, and we'll let rest another 12 hours. It's now the evening of day 4. We're getting such nice activity. I want to go ahead and feed a second time before going to bed. Listen to all of these bubbles. You may be very wary of the stinkiness at this stage, but it's all very, very normal. Consistency is still pretty weak, runny like it's been, maybe even more so, as you can see here. I'll keep our feeding ratio at 1 to 1 to 1, equal parts starter, water, and flour as before. For this feed, I've measured out 16 grams of each ingredient. Stir well as usual. And I'm actually going to use a fresh piece of cheesecloth, and we'll let this sit until morning at warm room temperature. It's now the morning of day 5, and I was quite surprised to find very little growth in the jar. Honestly, I was afraid I did something wrong. But it was obvious it was my same culture, because the smell of this is, wow, quite pungent and off-putting. It's definitely a cheesy sort of smell and kind of smells like vomit. So overall, very runny, very smelly. Now, having lost that first wave of microbes, we are now moving into a new phase of microbial growth. Very exciting. These early stages will likely be variable from starter to starter. This is all quite normal. Keep it going. Don't let the sudden, shockingly sudden, loss of visible activity deter you. I just fed 15 grams starter with an equal amount water and flour. Go ahead and stir, cover with the cheesecloth, and we'll let sit again at warm room temperature. We'll have another look this evening. It's now the evening of day 5. We've got a little bit of growth in the jar, maybe 30 to 50% increase in volume. very little. The smell is still pretty strong. The mixture continues to be runny. See how it just pours out of the jar. We'll do another 1 to 1 to 1 feed at 16 grams each, starter, water, flour. Stir well. We'll go ahead and move to a fresh jar as the last jar was getting pretty messy. Let this rest about 12 hours at warm room temperature. Morning of day 6. You'll notice there is a small increase in volume in my jar, about 20% I'd say, and things are really starting to look up, at least smell-wise. The cheesy, off-putting scent is diminished a bit, though it is still runny in consistency. I'll discard a little bit, leaving approximately 15 grams starter in the jar as before. If you are worried about approximating the amount of starter by looking at a glob in the jar, by all means just measure it out. Another 1 to 1 to 1 feed of equal amounts starter, water, flour. I always measure out the water and flour that I'll add to the jar. Stir, cover, and we'll let rest 12 more hours. Now we're on the evening of day 6. The cheesy smell is going away slowly but surely, getting maybe 30% growth in the jar. Consistency is still quite liquid. I'll feed 1 to 1 to 1 again, 15 grams starter, 15 grams water, 15 grams flour, and stir as usual. Cover, let rest, 12 hours. It's now the morning of day 7. We've gotten to the end of week 1. We're hitting approximately 100% increase in volume, or 2x today. I would caution against using a starter that's only reaching 2x volume increase, as you are ideally looking for a starter that can at least triple. Of course, if you're feeling like you just can't wait, go ahead and start practicing with your 1-week-old starter. It can be good to get your hands in some dough, but for a proper ferment and a great sourdough bread, you'll really want to use the second week to build up your starter's strength and activity. While week 1 was all about catching those natural or wild yeast, the second week will be all about building strength and really pushing the starter activity. The goal is a starter that can at least triple within a 4 to 6 hour time frame, fed 1 to 2 to 2, and kept warm room temperature. This is my 3.5-year-old starter, Ozzy, very happy and thriving. Our new starter is not quite there yet. Okay, back to where we were. Morning of day 7. About 2x increase as we saw. The smell today is vastly different. The mixture smells mild, and finally I'm starting to pick out slightly sour notes. That is what we're looking for. We're on the right track. A little stronger in consistency as well. Very nice. So we'll do another 1 to 1 to 1 feed, 15 grams each, into a fresh jar. I think this will be the last day with the cheesecloth, but for now, we'll keep it on and let the mixture rest 12 hours at warm room temperature. Now, day 7 before bed. Still getting some nice growth out of this culture. We'll do the same thing as we've been doing. Equal parts feed, 1 to 1 to 1, about 15 grams each, starter, water, and flour. We'll stir well, cover, let rest 12 hours at warm room temperature. Morning of day 8. Again, we're getting some stable, moderate growth. The starter is smelling wonderful, a little sour, even a little sweet. Instead of just discarding and tossing the excess starter at each feed, I'm now going to start collecting it in a bowl and freezing it. There are many sourdough discard recipes you can find online. I like to make pancakes at the end of each week with the collected discard. We'll go ahead and feed the remaining 15 grams in the jar with 15 grams water, 15 grams flour mix, and stir well. We're now done with the cheesecloth. We can use a clean jar here with a lid. Make sure the lid is loose. This is a live culture that requires air. We'll close up the discard and get that into the freezer. It's 12 hours later. The starter is now doubling. Looks nice and active. Listen to these bubbles. Discard all but 15 grams and feed with an equal amount of water and flour mix. Stir, loosely fit that lid, and rest 12 hours. Day 9, and you can smell. We've now got some definite sour notes coming through. Activity looks great, and the starter is more than doubling. We'll just keep going with the feeds. We'll collect the discard, then feed the 15 grams that remains in the jar, equal parts water and flour. Stir, rest 12 hours. 12 hours later, evening of day 9, we've got some beautiful activity tonight. I'm going to start feeding at a higher ratio now. So far, we've only done feeds with equal parts starter, water, and flour. Now we're going to bump it up to a 1 to 2 to 2 ratio feed. This means we'll add 2 times as much water and flour to the starter. For instance, here I weighed out 8 grams starter, so I'll go ahead and feed with 16 grams water and 16 grams of flour. As the starter increases in activity, it will eat up the food source faster and faster, so we must provide the beasties with enough flour and water so that the starter doesn't run out and just collapse. Now we're on day 10. You can see it was good timing to start feeding at a higher ratio. The starter has peaked, and then you can see the telltale signs that it has collapsed. Note the residue on the jar. This is a good sign of a healthy, active starter, a hungry starter. I'll discard all but around that 8 grams starter and feed with 16 grams water, 16 grams flour. This is again a 1 to 2 to 2 feed. We'll stir, put the lid back on, and let rest 12 hours. Evening of day 10. Got a pretty decent 2 to 2.5x rise in the jar. But once again, the starter has peaked and fallen. The more you feed post-peak after the starter has had time to fall, the weaker your starter will become over time. It's always best to feed right at peak. I think we're losing activity with these lower ratio feeds, so we're going to increase the feed ratio now to 1 to 3 to 3 and see if that helps. I'll carefully measure out 5 grams starter and add 3 times as much water and flour. We'll see what happens in 12 hours. Morning of day 11, and you can tell the starter has peaked but not been allowed to fall. This is much better. We're going to continue increasing our feed ratio, this time 1 to 4 to 4. I've discarded all but about 5 grams starter in the jar. I'm adding in 20 grams water and 20 grams flour. Let's see how this looks in the evening. 12 hours later, evening of day 11, and once again the starter has fallen. You can see we are maintaining a pretty steady 2.5x rise at each feed. We must still feed with more flour to keep up the feeding at peak. I'm going to now increase the feed ratio to 1 to 5 to 5. 5 grams starter, 25 grams water, 25 grams flour mix. Day 12, and we've got such a wonderfully active starter. Growth in the jar is around 2.5x, and I must say the starter smells so sweet, balanced with lovely sour notes. Let's feed again 1 to 5 to 5. 5 grams starter with 25 grams water and flour. As you know, we've been using a mixture of 30% rye flour, 70% bread flour. I'm going to cut back on the amount of rye we're using and drop everything down to 10% rye mix. This will increase the strength in our starter, which will allow the starter to rise a little higher and maintain peak a little longer. I weighed out what I have of the 30% rye flour mix into a new bowl, 155.5 grams. This means there is 46.5 grams rye flour in the bowl. We want a 10% rye mix, so we will bring the total flour up to 465 grams using bread flour. After adding an additional 310 grams bread flour, we now have our 10% rye flour mix. Go ahead and whisk together. We'll use this for all future feeds. Now it's the evening of day 12. Again, the starter has managed to peak and fall. What a nice starter we're making. Very, very active. Now that we've cut the rye percent down, I would expect a slight loss in activity. The more rye, the more activity you will see in a starter. So for this first feed, I'm going to start with a 1:4:4 ratio. 5 grams starter plus 20 grams each water and flour in a fresh jar. It's now the morning of day 13, and it looks like dropping the rye percent down was not enough to decrease the starter activity. Still, the starter has managed to peak and fall. We will need to keep up our feeds at a higher ratio. Look at the discard, much stronger fermented mix here. This is from the increased bread flour in the flour mix. We'll feed 1:5:5 this time, 5 grams starter plus 25 grams water and flour, and we'll take a look at the starter later this evening. Now the evening of day 13, and we've got a nice 2.5 times increase in volume. I'll feed again 1:5:5, but tomorrow I'm going to put this starter on my usual feeding schedule of 3 times per day. I think it's about ready. You certainly do not need to switch to 3 times per day if your schedule does not allow, but I'd recommend feeding with higher ratios in that situation, even upwards of 1:10:10 if your starter can handle it. We're now on the last day of the second week, in the morning of day 14, and I'm going to start feeding 3 times per day, like I do with my regular starter. This 2.5x max peak we've been getting is very good, but I ideally like my starters to peak over triple. Let's see how the starter handles my usual 3 times per day feeding regimen. The starter is very active and very nice. Because I'll be feeding again in 7 hours, I'll use a ratio feed of 1:2:2 here. I've measured out 8 grams starter and fed with 16 grams each water and flour. Stir, cover, and let rest until midday at warm room temp as usual. Now, at about 7 hours later, you can see the starter has risen about 2.5x. I'll feed again 1:2:2. 8 grams starter plus 16 grams water plus 16 grams flour. Go ahead and stir, rest 7 hours at a warm room temperature. Now we're in the evening of day 14. We'll do my usual overnight feed ratio of 1:5:5, but something special for tonight. I'd like to watch this one build using a time lapse. So I'm actually going to feed 10 grams of starter with 50 grams water, 50 grams flour, more than I would usually mix up. I'll mix this well and then move 100 grams of the mixture to a jar that has been pre-marked with rubber bands showing initial volume, 2x, and 3x. I just figured it would be interesting seeing my setup for this experiment. I've set the starter in the jar in my oven with the light on to maintain a temperature of around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The timer can help us to see what's going on over the course of 10 hours. We hit 2x around 5 hours, and max peak around 3x at 7.5 hours at this 1:5:5 ratio. After hitting peak, the starter loses its strength and begins to fall. Now let's see what our new starter is capable of after a 1:2:2 feed. As expected, Due to the increased inoculation, we hit 2x a bit faster, this time around the 4-hour mark, and we hit max peak at 3x a bit before the 7-hour mark. At only 14 days old, the starter is still considered pretty young. With proper care, especially following the rule to feed at peak, this starter will continue to strengthen over time and will likely begin peaking at higher and higher volumes over time. Store your starter in the fridge for extended breaks. You can usually go 2 to 4 weeks without a single feed. To bring a refrigerated, dormant starter back to high activity, please see my other video on starter maintenance and leaven building. I'll post the link in the description below. Another great backup for your starter is to dehydrate it. Dehydrated, it will store for years in a cool, dark place. I also have a video here on YouTube all about dehydrating and rehydrating your sourdough starter. See the link below. And finally, if you'd like to jump in and use this starter now to make a loaf of bread, check the link below on my method of how to make a basic open crumb sourdough bread. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video can be helpful to those beginning their sourdough journey. Please check out my Instagram at Foolproof Baking for more helpful tips, methods, and full recipes. Happy baking!